Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm April Knight, and you're watching our News 2 election special sponsored by the Bryan Roach campaign. Today we have Albert Bryan with us and Senator Tragenza Roach, and they're going to be sharing with you some of the key aspects of their platforms, as well as issues that are significant to the territory, as well as make their final pitch to voters as well, because in a few days, voters will head to the polls again to make the final decision on who's going to win the governor's race. So if you want to hear where they stand on certain issues, stay with us for the next hour. I'm sure that these gentlemen need no introduction, but I'm going to say some things anyway. Albert was a labor commissioner for 8 years. Mm-hmm. You founded, and you're a founder and president of the ABRA Group. That's correct. Co-founder and managing partner of Master Strategies VI, and you were once the chairman of the Economic Development Authority and the Government Development Bank. That's correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, okay. So, and then Senator Roach, 3-term senator, taught at UVI as well. You served as legal counsel to the VI Commissioner of Education earlier in your career. And then you were executive director of the Board of Education, among other public interest roles. So let's get some things out of the way very quickly before we get to the meat of your platform. Let's clarify what happened with this debate situation.
Right.
According to the other camp, you refused to debate, but I saw a response from you on Facebook that said it was a scheduling issue. So what really happened there?
So we were never actually approached by the other camp to debate. We've had no conversations with them. Mm-hmm. The consortium called us and asked us if we could debate on Tuesday, and we said we couldn't debate on that day. We gave them a date, the Monday before the election, because one of the things that we take into account is we've done over 15, 16 debates, a lot of which the governor chose not to show up to. As a matter of fact, he canceled the last debate that we were really counting on to give us the edge in the election, the Channel 12 consortium debate. That would probably have been the most watched debate of the season. So we couldn't say yes, and then we'd have had 4 other requests at the time to do debates. And what happened during the general election is we got real off message attending these debates. And we think it actually hurt us in terms of our time speaking with people, contacting them, shaking hands, because that's what actually got us to this point. So we're open and ready to debate. Where we have Monday night, I think we still have that time carved out. So if they want to come, we're more than ready.
Okay, Senator Roach, I wanted to ask you about the free tuition policy. Now, there's a bit of controversy surrounding the ownership of this particular legislation. The governor sent the Senate his version of the bill, but you actually have your own piece of legislation already in the Senate. When I asked Governor Mapp about it, he said that the governor's bill cannot be preempted. What is your take on that?
Well, first of all, I'd like people to understand what preemption means, because sometimes we use the words and we think that everybody is on the same page.
Okay.
Some people think I did something to stop the governor from bringing his bill, and he has helped people think that way as well. Preemption simply means that an issue is before the legislature already, and I depend on the legal counsel of the legislature to make those decisions. What happens is that you submit a bill idea, they research whether something similar has been submitted, and then they write you and they tell you that you've been preempted. So whether the governor has an issue with the legal counsel or not, that's his business. I take the word of the legal counsel. These are the rules of the legislature that we operate by. It said that my bill that had been introduced in 2013, in 2015, and in 2017 preempted the governor.
Okay.
As you know, when I came into the legislature, we were following the Tragenza refinery closure. We were following the economic decline, economic recession, whatever you want to call it. And so finding a source to fund the bill has always been an issue. But I wanted to keep introducing it into the legislature because I felt it was an important idea, a historic idea that could change the future of all the children in the territory. I had co-sponsors for the bill as well. When the governor sent in his measure, a funding source had been identified, but people should also be aware that I had felt the idea so significant that I said, even if we didn't succeed in getting it through the legislature, I would bring it to the Bryan Roach campaign as one of our platform ideas to accomplish it from an executive level. It was after we started talking about it publicly that the governor came out with his proposal. Now, what has happened is that the bill has now been amended. My original bill has been amended, and the legal counsel has redrafted it. The legislature has a process. It's called pro forma. A pro forma process of bills, and that's when they officially get a bill number and are assigned to committee. And the president of the legislature has decided that the bill will be submitted to a joint committee of finance and education.
Your bill?
Yes, and it will be considered by that committee. If the legislature declines to enact the measure as I have proposed it, anybody is free to submit a different version or idea of the bill, and they may be successful in getting it through.
And does that automatically open up the doors for the governor's bill to be considered?
Sure. Preemption just creates an orderly process of dealing with ideas so that we're not spending a whole lot of time having the same subject matter before different committees of the legislature. There is support for the bill. The governor has created this election frenzy around the bill because he created all these ads upon submission of the bill to the legislature. The bill is not intended to have the local government take up any obligations of students that may be addressed by federal funds. It is to supplement what they may get from Pell Grants, etc.
So federal funds first, and then whatever doesn't get covered.
That's right. So the process, if we want to have it affect students coming in 2019, which is the idea, that is the intent, students are required to apply for their federal funding by March. They really don't get responses until July. And then when that response comes from the federal government, we should be prepared to then determine how we would supplement their award. So there was no need, no urgency for it to be enacted in September to make an election issue of it. And it was really unfortunate that the bill became an election issue because—
And it was called into special session without a bill in front of the legislators.
Exactly. So you have students, it's a free tuition. It's not a cup, a campaign cup or pen or pencil or t-shirt. This is something that the government of the Virgin Islands is going to invest in its people, and we want to have conversations about what happens next. What are the students going to be required to do? What grade point average will they be required to maintain? What will happen after they graduate? If we require them to stay here for employment, how will we facilitate their having meaningful employment instead of frustrating them? All of these are important questions to decide, not just to rush it through a process so I could make an ad and say, oh, vote for me, I passed the free tuition bill. It was never intended as an election issue. You see, you get me carried away with it.
Yeah, I know, I can see that. Okay, let me get to this next topic, which is what's on the ballot on the 20th. When I asked the governor this question, he said that there are dangers to installing a new administration. First and foremost, he said that it will slow down the hurricane recovery process. And second, it will strain relationships with Washington if we have a Democratic governor, since the president is so very openly against Democrats. Do you believe that?
That is nonsense. I mean, the one thing that he keeps bragging about is his appropriations and his plans, and you know, administrations transition all the time. When I left labor, there was a lot of money that was left there in indirect costs. There were money in grants that had to be administered because programs were in process. None of that money disappeared. When you look at what's happening in Congress now, the blue wave is making a comeback, and now we have the House again. So it reestablishes the balance that goes on in Washington. This is more about being able to manage the money that's coming in at a local level. And when you look at every single department, every single one is broken. It's like putting gas into a car with no wheels. And you've seen over the past couple months how the breakdowns in education, in the labor department, other breakdowns in human services. There are a lot of things that are going on in our government now that have destabilized the very grand process. Over $1.5 million from human services was recently sent back, and even more funds are in jeopardy because the focus is on all of this money and the election that's going on right now instead of the people, and really managing the funds and making sure that departments are able to process. It's part of this state of the emergency scheme that he has had for the last year to make the process now so that he makes all of the decisions. Tragenza, Senator Roach recently had legislation overturned where now he has to come to the legislature and explain why we have this state of emergency, and it's kind of mum now. Now it's not under an emergency anymore. So what we're looking at is going in. We do not plan to do what he did, totally dismantle the government and fire people and send home people. We plan to look for the people who are doing their jobs well and using technology and other process improvement, help to get the process better. Put the people where they need to be, give the supervisors and the directors the autonomy, and put the commissioners to work establishing policy that will make for a smooth transition of government and expedite the use of these federal funds.
And you know, when the governor talks about that, he conveniently leaves out of the conversation that he was not single-handedly responsible for getting these federal funds. We have a Democratic delegate to Congress.
That's right.
And she was the very first person who introduced the idea of the 100% Medicare reimbursement that we're receiving now. A delegation from the legislature also went to Congress to lobby for that funding. A Democratic Senate, Democratic delegate who played a critical role in getting some of that funding. So we should not continue the narrative that he alone was responsible for getting these funds, and so it makes this
and if he
this
doesn't
kind of
get
argument
reelected,
possible.
everything will stop. All the construction will stop. Well, that certainly seems to be the idea that's being sold to voters. Now, I want to ask you, how do you foresee your relationship with the legislature should you get elected? I've been covering the Senate for a while, and I'm noticing that there's sort of a strained kind of relationship with the executive branch. And we can see that, and sometimes the governor is saying that he's not going to enforce, certain laws, even though he overrode it. The Senate overrode the veto, and then essentially something is law, and he said he's not going to enforce it. Do you see that kind of relationship continuing, considering now that we have a lot of new senators too?
To your point, I think that this governor has a blatant disregard for respecting the three branches of government. And the powers. If you look at what he tried to do with the presiding judge, trying to remove him during his tenure, overreaching the powers of the executive branch. One of the things that I talk about all the time is reducing the amount of power that is invested in the governor of the Virgin Islands. It creates the kind of tyrannical situations that we have today. So working with the legislature, one of the things that we have been very successful at is uniting the Democratic Party. And we've done that by actually sharing our stage, the gubernatorial stage, which is a larger stage, and allowing Democratic senators to come in, repeating the things that they hold dear to their platform and ensuring them that as Democrats and as Virgin Islanders, we're going to support the agendas that they are pushing forward. So when it comes time for re-election, their things will be premier in terms of having been accomplished because they've been executed. I think this is really important in establishing that. We were successful in electing 13 Democrats. Now, I don't know if that's how the majority will end up, but we know one thing, that we will have a majority that is dominated by Democrats. We'll have a Democrat in the Senate, 1 in DC, and 2 in the government house. And it's important for us, during December, we've already decided that we're going to kind of get together and put all of the priorities of the senators and the priorities of the administration so we can create an agenda and move that forward. If we're going to really change course in the Virgin Islands, we're going to have an amiable relationship between the legislature and the executive branch. Just one more example. When the governor sent down the last ArcLight
agreement, the deal,
debacle agreement, they were getting upset because the questions that the senators posed to the developers, they wanted a little bit more. Well, that's a good thing. Why would this legislature be on the side of the government and the governor be supporting the lime tree people? You would think that the legislature and the executive branch would work together and say, well, if the legislature wants more for the people, why isn't that a good thing? The executive branch now goes back to the table and says, well, they denied your first attempt. Here's what you can do to make this deal sweeter and to get us the Virgin Islands a better shake. Instead,
that's what you would like to see.
Exactly. Instead, you have the executive branch now defending the contract with the contractor. Who are they fighting against? Not the legislature. They're fighting against the people of the Virgin Islands. So those are the kind of things that we would like to really look at. And we're not always going to agree, but I think that we'll have a great working relationship.
I mean, theoretically, since you're coming out of the legislature, Senator, that should help.
Well, I would underscore exactly what Albert said, because you have to understand the function of each branch of government, and you have to have respect for it. You pointed an example there where the governor has said on more than one occasion, even if you override it, I'm not going to implement it. He said that. When we voted to increase the bond funding for GERS by $100 million, he said if the bonds were floated, he wasn't going to give the money to GERS. They could go pack a lunch. So it's impossible for you to believe that you can have a working relationship with people if you have no regard for their role and no respect for their positions. And there are at least 6 of the returning members of the legislature with whom I have worked. And one thing that I know every single person would say is that I am able to work with people. As a member of the minority, knowing that you need votes from the majority to pass any measure, whether we had a disagreement on some issue yesterday or the day before, I come to each person and I say, this is the idea that I have. Will you support it? That's how you regard people in a system of checks and balances. The governor goes around and makes this big production. He has signs with my face on his signs. And they have no, that I say no each time. Where are the checks and balances? I'm not supposed to be a yes man. When you come and say you're going to put a pipeline under the sea of St. Croix and it's going to be 2 miles, and you're going to allow tankers to come into that area with 5 million barrels of oil, and if there is an accident, you have to also get help from Puerto Rico. You have to wait for them to mobilize and come to St. Croix. You can't expect me to say yes to that with a half a day's hearing, no public input. So if you have respect for the role of the legislature, you're going to be successful in working with them.
We were talking about GRS a little while ago, and this is the opportunity for you to reiterate to folks what your plan is about. Now, I've heard you speak in several forums, Albert, and you said that your plan for shoring up the government employees' retirement system is 3-pronged. You're going to lower the unfunded liability, secure payments to retirees, and lower the cost of the retirement system to the government. You also had several objectives under that, and you identified 5 funding sources. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So the funding sources, I think, are the most important. And we didn't come up with this thing just like pie in the sky. We actually sat down with our team. We reviewed a lot of the studies that were done by the GRS over the years. We reviewed the studies from the task force that were submitted and came up with some things that we think were important, like you said. And the number one thing is to make sure that we don't reduce the annuity, the payment of people who are already retired. The further away from retirement you are, the longer you have to plan for it. So there's a lot of education piece in our in our plan as well too. But the 5 funding sources, the most impactful funding source are distilleries. And the reason being is because we get the rum cover over. So as we produce, we get all of that money back. We get 2 grabs at it. So adding a distillery is number one in terms of generating revenue. With a revenue of even $80 million a year, we would have enough money to finance a $600 million bond to the GRS system. There's 2 grabs at the rum cover money. You get 1 grab because you actually sent the rum.
Right.
And then we split the rest of the rum that's produced by other islands besides Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. We get a piece of that too. So if Puerto Rico produces 60% of the rum that's sent, for instance, they get 60% of that extra money. Well, they've been doing the calculation wrong for years. So Treasury actually owes us probably $100 million. Getting that calculation and getting $100 million would also be a new source of revenue. They wouldn't have to pay it back to us immediately. They could pay it to us over time, but it would guarantee a new revenue source to either fund a bond or to put money into the system. Sports gaming is another one. We have this $120 million fiber optic cable that we invested in that really hasn't given us anything except better Netflix. So if we use sports gaming as a new opportunity for the Virgin Islands, we can then be able to get money that'll be designated for the GRS by having sports gaming companies in the Virgin Islands. The gasoline and the gasoline tax is something that we've been debating for years, and we were almost there at one point, but we couldn't come to an agreement, and we kind of lost that opportunity. We could still go back if we get the refinery pumping again. And then finally, I think the most impactful for the future earnings of the Virgin Islands would be our cannabis research and patent registry. So the cannabis industry in the United States is a $24 billion industry. By establishing a research center in our technology park, there are certain strains, oils, topicals, different things that they're extracting from this botanical now that can be patented. Every time that thing sells, that product, whatever it is, if it's an oil, every time it sells, the Virgin Islands would get a piece of that money from the patent. This is a huge opportunity for us because it's just like Viagra or McDonald's or Kentucky. Every time a piece of chicken sells, Colonel Sandals gets money. Why would they come to the Virgin Islands? Because we're not going to give them a 90% tax break. We're going to give them a 60% tax break. But that's a huge tax break anywhere else. And that the rest of all of that money that's generated from taxes would be another funding source for the GRS. The thing about our administration coming into office is about having the ability to come out and lead. Before we started talking about medical marijuana research, everybody else was quiet. The MAP administration had 4 years, they never commented on it. The same thing with the tuition bill.
But it's a touchy topic still for some people.
But even the GRS is a touchy. When we started talking about the GRS, people told us we were crazy to create a plan. If you're going to lead in anywhere and you're going to move people forward, you're going to have to take risks. The reason why they call it a vision is because only you can see it. Leadership is being able to convince a group of people that this vision actually exists and that we should march forward towards it. That's leadership. We don't have that in the Virgin Islands. We have people who are more concerned with being reelected than moving the people forward. I'm here for one reason, to fix it. And that's the only reason. So Tragenza and I, we're going to be doing the things that put the Virgin Islands on a new course, on a course towards finally resolving some of these lifelong problems. And that starts with people.
All right. We're going to take a little break. We're going to circle back to a few of the topics that we spoke about. You're watching our News 2 election special sponsored by the Bryan Roach campaign. We'll be right back.
On the eve of this critical election, let us add clarity to what Albert and I mean by change course now.
It's a recognition that the Virgin Islands has been on the wrong path for far too long. It is a commitment to a purposeful government that actually produces results. It has nothing to do with delaying or stopping our recovery from the storms. We value the recent progress made by our disaster volunteers and the resources secured by our government to include the delegates to Congress and the members of the legislature.
Change course now is not just about this administration or an election. It is about not letting our government do the same thing over and over while expecting a different result.
That is why our neighbors from Frederickstead to Bordeaux and Coral Bay say that change just can't wait.
We will hold ourselves accountable to the people of the Virgin Islands.
Vote number 5 to change course now towards a brighter Virgin Islands for all of us.
Paid for by Bryan Roach for Governor and Lieutenant Governor.
Hi, this is Tragenza Roach. In these final days of the election, you may have heard false, desperate advertisements sponsored by our opponents that I have been against the betterment of my friends and family on St. Croix. As a senator, I have had to say no, along with my colleagues, when we believe the governor has abused his power or has made decisions that rob opportunities from hard-working residents. For example, I have said no to the governor appointing his brother as Port Authority Executive Director, cousin to the Port Authority Board, and sister-in-law to the WICO Board instead of other more qualified Virgin Islanders. I have said no to purchasing executive limousines instead of buying new ambulances for our hospitals or first paving the roads in Frederickstead. I've said no to raising commissioners' salaries $10,000 to $20,000 higher while shortchanging deserving teachers at Ricardo Richards and police officers who patrol the streets in Christiansted. I did vote no on the Lime Tree Agreement because the governor forced us into a $40 million payday loan from a $1 billion company, pushed us to sell 300 acres of our precious Crucian soil at $10,000 an acre without an appraisal. And I said no to a deal that gave folks on St. Croix 17.5% less of refinery income than we were promised in the previous agreement. As leaders, we are measured not solely by our flowery words, but also our deeds and record as well. I proudly stand on my 3 terms as your senator over the Map Potter's new 90 days of busy work. On November 20th, the Bryan Roach team asks for your continued support and vote because change can't wait. Thank you.
This is Tragenza Roach, your candidate for Lieutenant Governor on the Bryan Roach team. As a senator in the Virgin Islands legislature, I have been pleased to support many measures on behalf of the people of St. Croix. I voted yes to $100 million in Garvey bonds financing for road repair work, which the governor let sit from 2015. I voted yes to making St. Croix the sports capital of the Caribbean by providing $20 million in financing to create a state-of-the-art sports facility at the Pauli Joseph Stadium. The governor has let it sit from 2014, and what is there now is a stadium in ruins, shrouded in dirt. I voted yes to $3.5 million to dredge the Schooner Bay Channel so that Gallows Bay could become a state-of-the-art facility and attract the small luxury liners. I voted yes to establishing the Bachelor of Nursing program at the University of the Virgin Islands so that St. Croix students would not have to travel to St. Thomas to complete their degrees. I voted yes to acquiring the property adjacent to Government House to create a proper governor's residence and to end the governor's wasteful spending of hundreds of thousands of dollars for accommodations at the Ritz-Carlton and private villas. I voted yes to constructing urgent care centers for the people of St. Croix in the absence of a proper hospital, and I voted yes to override the governor's veto of that legislation. Vote Bryan Roach, number 5 on your ballot, to end MAP's tyranny and to create a Virgin Islands for all of us.
Paid for by Bryan Roach for Governor and Lieutenant Governor.